Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on all things CLV. My name is Ryan East. I'm a marketing director here at Alida, and it is my pleasure today to introduce you to the panelists that will be presenting. First up, we have Amy Ko. Amy Ko is a principal CX consultant with Alida Professional Services, and she has 10 years of experience as a CX guru. She's responsible for building Alida's CX practice and delivering thought leadership. Our second panelist is Kevin Kwong. He's a principal of Alida's value engineering practice and brings 10 years experience building programs across industries and the business cases behind them. Last up, we have Paul Parsons, who has joined Alida with 15 years of startup, founder, and advisory experience in services, telecom, FinServe, and gaming. He is a senior solution engineer and product specialist. A quick note before I pass it over to our panelists. If you do have a question, please submit it using the Zoom Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll ask it at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, please welcome your panel.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on customer lifetime value. Let's start with a basic question for everyone to get aligned. What exactly is CLV? At a high level, CLV is the worth of a customer relationship to a business. This is really an oversimplification, but essentially we are thinking about value in terms of two levers, time and money. And my colleague Kevin will actually dive a bit deeper into what these levers really mean.
Thanks, Amy. So customer lifetime value is really a way to look at the dollars generated from a customer over a period of time. And there's a couple different ways to calculate CLV. And the best formula really depends on the context and the situation we want to utilize that metric. So for example, a very simple way to look at CLV is the annual revenue of a customer multiplied by the customer relationship in terms of years. And we subtract the customer acquisition cost. So that's really an easy way to consider the dollars that a customer brings in over the entire customer relationship, along with the costs of acquiring that customer. So we could also look at a more traditional CLV formula, which considers gross margin, retention rate, as well as a discount rate, which factors in inflation. And this is great for looking at CLV over longer periods of time. There's also a predictive CLV model, which seeks to estimate CLV based on transaction numbers, average order value, and what a typical customer lifespan might be. And this provides kind of a future-looking measure of value, and it's based more on averages. So there's other formulas out there. There's more nuanced ways to calculate CLV as well. There is no one right formula. And selecting a measure of CLV is really dependent on what your goals are, as well as what data is really available to you. So I do want to point out, though, that the key carry through between all these three formulas up here is this concept of margin. So customer lifetime value is used to really understand the value of a customer, including the costs of acquiring them. So I also want to add on one more nuance of CLV that you might want to consider. So think about what is the lifetime of a customer. So for a business that has seen significant changes in the recent years, it might be a little bit more useful to think about a customer lifetime as the 5 most recent years versus perhaps a 20-year, 10-year, or even longer. Paul, what are your thoughts about CLV?
Yeah, so to build on some of Kevin's formulas, there were really 3 key value drivers that come out of the CLV formulas. So increasing revenue per customer with things like segmentation and loyalty, increase your margin with more knowledge and customer experience, and you can reduce customer churn based on a whole slew of factors. This is where we start bridging this more academic formula and outcome for CLV into the real world. I wanted to dive into a couple examples here about CLV execution in a specific segment. So we're going to look at the super small startup that is, compared to a massive conglomerate, both in the e-commerce space. Now, this list is from Shopify's blog on what is CLV. It's designed for individuals that are starting up a store on their website. But I think there's some really interesting outcomes here. So all of the suggestions that they make towards improving CLV kind of fit into one of these 4 buckets: either customer experience, cost of retention, segmentation, and then loyalty and rewards program. Now, for e-commerce, the suggestions like setting up expectations, running deals for existing customers, interviewing and connecting with your best customers, creating an incentive program, like these are all fairly standard business practices for most companies, and whether you're in sort of in tech, hospitality, CPG, pretty much any industry. But the mechanics of how you move the needle on CLV are different, because the key drivers of increasing revenue, increasing your margin or reducing costs, and reducing customer churn are applicable at even a startup level. So to contrast to this comes out of a report from IRI Worldwide about CLV on a much larger scale. This graph is showing the correlation between grocery pickup locations and Walmart's market cap. Now, this isn't our graphic. It's the direct comparison is a little bit dramatic. But this is why this is interesting. So grocery pickup was one of those many specific personalized experiences that they implemented in this time frame. They were removing barriers from customers being able to access their inventory and make a purchase. So they became customer obsessed, and this philosophy shift directly impacted their CLV. So between 2014 and the end of 2019, they had 20 straight quarters of consistent sales growth at a store level on average, which is absolutely insane. And that's pre-COVID. Another really interesting stat on this side is that the average basket size of grocery pickup was about twice what a normally would normally spend in store. It's a super fascinating data point. So whether you're kind of a one-person operation or at the top of the Fortune 500 list, many of the concepts and methods of executing a comprehensive CLV plan can be used. So that's a super quick overview of the way that two businesses, both in the e-commerce space, are using CLV sort of as that same North Star metric on a small and a large scale.
Great. Thank you, Paul and Kevin. Now that we got a bit of guidance on what CLV is and how to think about it, let's actually dive into a couple questions that Kevin, Paul, and I have been thinking through recently together. Kevin and Paul, can you talk about what metrics businesses can and should measure that contribute to CLV?
Yeah, I'll go ahead first. So I think that this is a great question, and I come up with it, or I come against it quite often. And this is because I work often with clients that operate in slices or silos of the overall business, and they don't really feel like they have the ability to really impact CLV holistically. When I think about CLV, I like to break it down into a couple of pieces that attribute to lifetime value. And it's a great way for teams to show individual impact for those metrics that attribute upwards. So for example, Paul mentioned Spotify, and they looked at CLV in a few different couple of buckets of metrics. I would kind of do the same, and I would look at CLV through, I think, 3 key areas, and that's average order value or average transaction value. I put in customer retention in there, as well as customer acquisition cost. So three major areas of looking at customer lifetime value. And of course, when you think about these different metrics, it opens up a whole world of possibilities for additional metrics. For example, what really affects average order value? Well, AOV can be impacted and affected through things like customer satisfaction, brand perception, ease of doing business, customer experience, personalization, market messaging. And that's just one of the factors of CLV. And it can be impacted by so many other contributing factors.
Yeah, I think if we take sort of the average order value, for example, even for something like running shoes. So I'm an amateur runner on the absolute best of days. So I might go through 2 pairs of shoes a year. Marathon runners are going to do multiple times that. So obviously the marathoner is a more valuable customer because of the higher spend, right? But when you start taking discounting into consideration, how expensive are they to reach? What is the margin on those shoes, the actual product? What's the total addressable market of that segment? And then you sort of have this overreaching kind of problem of, strategic resource allocation. So like, how do you understand the delta on how time or cost intensive it is to implement a change? All that ties right back into CLV. So trying to ground your CLV formula in real world, tangible and verifiable data is the only way to use it as an effective North Star for your business.
Great. Thank you both for sharing that. And this is more of a specific question. So why should we actually care about CLV now? given variables such as our current economic climate? Is it because Forrester says so?
I think, well, CLV has been around for a long time. It's definitely not a new concept. And I think perhaps CLV is getting more popular again as a metric because of what it represents, which is revenue, retention, and the cost of acquisition or cost of doing business. And these have always really been on the minds of executives everywhere. It doesn't matter the industry, the company, or even the size, right? They always care about revenue, retention, and cost. And CLV really conveniently packages all of that into a single number, and we can benchmark that across time. Regarding the current economic climate, I think Paul raised a really excellent point about thinking about addressable market and reach and how expensive it could be to tap into those specific markets. In times like these, one of the most interesting and one of the best things to do with CLV is segmenting and prioritizing your customers. We want to really understand what the CLV is associated with different profiles, different customer cohorts, and we want to identify what high value customers look like and who they are and what other attributes they might have. And this kind of enables us to do a couple of different things for the business. So one, it helps us focus efforts on those high valuable profiles, and we really want to make sure we retain them. Secondly, we can identify customers that look similar to those high value customers. They might not have current high spend today, or they might not be high CLV customers today. But if they look similar to those high CLV customers, we can look for ways to nurture them into that same profile. And we might also want to consider the costs, right? Wherever there's significant costs, we can explore ways to improve margins in those areas. So that's kind of a third area of what we can think about in terms of CLV, especially in today's economic climate. And CLV is really a great way to think about and prioritize where businesses can really drive the most impact. And I think that's on everyone's minds today with ever tightening resources.
For sure. And I think that when it comes to the Forrester report, I think that CLV should be a key North Star metric for your business, but not really because Forrester says so. Having these guiding North Star metrics is a great way to get a snapshot of both the health of your business and use it to make strategic decisions kind of at that high level. But I think the caveat is you really have to use it directionally with a context in mind. So think of building a software product in the real world. So ideation of any product should start with customer interviews. Are you solving a real problem for these people that you want to reach, or are you solving a problem that you think that they have? And if we remember back to Kevin's slide at the beginning, and I don't think there's a test at the end of this on those formulas, but predictive CLV is anchoring your calculations in as much historical and trending data to provide a tangible forecast for your business. So it's really easy to not discount accurately when using CLV. And the only disservice to that is that it harms your business. You're making decisions based on wrong or false information. There's always exceptions because there's not really a one-size-fits-all methodology. And we're just to throw out to another vertical like mergers and acquisitions, CLV can be used to determine how much of an asset your customers or your company's customers are. So like there's always a home for CLV in every business, as long as the context is right. So I feel like that was a lot of information on the sort of the academic side of this. Amy, we've talked a lot about CLV, what it is, how does this relate to the customer experience and insights?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I love this question as an Alida person because not only are we in the market research and insight space, we're also in the business of CX. So when I look at the audience makeup of the webinar, I'm actually seeing folks from these two disciplines kind of converging together, which I think is a reflection of where our space is going right now and into the future. This dialogue about metrics, measurement, and insights is uniting different departments within businesses. So as far as the relationship, let me start off with customer journey mapping, which is an exercise that all businesses should conduct to clearly identify critical touch points throughout their customer journey, which is often nonlinear. Businesses are infiltrating our lives in the physical space, in the digital space. So understanding how and where that's happening will be important to staying competitive. Customer journey mapping exercises will also unearth insights for businesses who can establish listening posts for feedback collection at those critical touch points. In other words, businesses can combat trends like increasing survey fatigue by being smarter, decreasing survey fatigue by being smarter and more pointed with how and where they listen to customers to ultimately understand the variables that impact value perception. And we can't talk about feedback collection without closed loop actions. When I say closed loop, I'm talking about the inner and outer loops. Closing the inner loop is when businesses take action on feedback, for example, from surveys with individual customers who said they had issues with like shipping. And closing the outer loop is when businesses take action on more of a systemic level. And how closed loop actions relate to CLV is that the system can be used to sustain and even extend the customer's lifetime with your business.
Hey, Amy. Sorry, I wanted to just quickly interject here because what you're describing really highlights the importance of measuring and benchmarking. So when we talk about closing the loop, we also want to capture those metrics and KPIs that really help us understand if we're successful, right? So through benchmarking across time, we can really see the impacts that closing the loop might have on CLV, or perhaps even the metrics that attribute and contribute to CLV.
Yeah, exactly, Kevin. And businesses can use measurement and benchmarking and all that good stuff to make systemic improvements for internal and external processes. The last point I'll make is about the automation of CX processes. Today, businesses have the technology to create a consistent and positive experience for customers. And what I mean by this is that businesses need to think about those listening posts themselves as touch points in the customer journey.
And I think that leads sort of into the next question here from my side. From that CX and insights perspective, should CLV be used in place of like these traditional North Star metrics like NPS, CES, and CSAT? Like CLV is the holistic view of these outcomes from measuring CX, but like where does this fit in?
I don't think it should be used in place of your key metrics. My take is that if you already have a metric or a set of metrics that you use to measure customers' temperature, stick to what you're already doing. And I would explore CLV as an addition to your portfolio of metrics.
Yeah, Amy, I definitely agree, especially with that last point, to explore CLV as an additional concept. And I'm calling it a concept here instead of a metric because I actually feel like that's where CLV is its most powerful. It's as this concept. So you can ask yourself, like everyone on this call today, ask yourself, does your team's metrics currently consider three main factors that contribute towards CLV, which is 1, revenue from your customers, 2, the length of that customer relationship, and 3rd, the cost to acquire those customers. So metrics are really important because we can't really improve what we can't measure. However, we also shouldn't be measuring CLV for the sake of measuring CLV alone. And that's why I actually believe that it's the concepts of CLV and what CLV represents that make it so much more powerful.
Very insightful, Kevin. Thank you. We previously talked about this shift in disparate departments really starting to talk to each other and work with each other within businesses. I think we should expand on that. So which departments or teams should actually focus on CLV?
Yeah, I think CLV is a fantastic metric to use at an aggregate level, especially when we're looking at operations and finance functions as a whole. But I'm really going to double down on that concept of CLV and that the concept is more important than capturing CLV itself. And the concept of CLV is actually important across every single team in the business. If your organization already tracks CLV and you can get access to the data to calculate it, by no means, definitely use it. It's a very useful North Star metric. However, if you're unable to benchmark CLV directly, I think back to my previous point, just consider the 3 areas that CLV encompasses and use those relevant proxies. So I've recently been working with a lot of healthcare clients, and When I'm thinking about those patient experience teams in healthcare, I'm thinking, for revenue from customers, we might look at ease of booking, for example. How easily can a patient make a booking online or over the phone? Because that's, at the end of the day, revenue coming in. The length of a customer relationship, that's patient retention. How do we keep patients engaged, re-engaged? How do we ensure that we have an active line to them throughout that relationship? And the cost to acquire those customers, an interesting way to think about cost of acquisition is actually a net promoter score, right? Net promoter score, promoters, by definition, they tell their friends, family about the great experiences they have, and that's actually going to lower costs of acquisition. So it's a very interesting way to think about CLV, just beyond CLV as a singular metric.
Yeah, and I think that another great example in the healthcare side is the Medicare star ratings. So for anyone that isn't or doesn't work in healthcare on a regular basis, this is a yearly analysis released from every fall, I think it is, to measure how well Medicare Advantage, Plan C and Plan D insurance plans perform. So it's rated on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Now, they go over 5 categories for sort of all the business units. So 2 of those categories are 1, member complaints, problems, and churn. And 2 is customer service on the health plan. And again, this is for every area, like the surgery, intake, every ecosystem that healthcare touches. So moving the needle by sort of that star rating by 1 or 2% can translate into millions upon millions of revenue. So holistically looking at insights, sort of customer experience as an organizational operation and process and methodology. And again, with that high level CLV North Star is a way to deeply affect the bottom line for every business. And as we sort of go just before our Q&A here, we're going to talk about sort of Alita, what we do, things that support CLV-centric products. So we talked about segmentation a little bit earlier. We've been building communities with our clients for over 20 years. Being able to identify the right people to ask the right questions is of paramount importance in today's climate. Our surveys tool is becoming more comprehensive to access hard to reach audiences with the launch of conversational surveys. It's our text message survey tool. And our customer journeys let you monitor any of the outcomes of all of these digital touch points that your company has. And lastly, Actions. It's our rule engine. This lets you send activities based off of triggers that close the loop with every single customer so nobody falls through the cracks. So CLV for us here at Alita is one of our key drivers, and we've made it as easy as possible for you to do the same. Now I'm going to pass it over to Amy.
Thank you, Paul. All right. So we had some great questions coming in to the Q&A. So the first one I'll ask is, in the formulas you showed, there was customer acquisition cost and gross margin. Is there a difference between how they are used in CLV?
Yeah, I can take this one. So let's talk about gross margin for a second. And gross margin is calculated revenue minus cost of goods sold divided by revenue. So let's talk about cost of goods sold now. And cost of goods sold, it encompasses more than just customer acquisition costs. So by definition, when we're looking at the equations that use gross margin, we're considering more variables, just more factors. But think about COGS for a second, right? We need to consider how your company and how your industry defines and thinks about cost of goods sold. So for example, in SaaS technology, training and implementation, those are considered costs to sell your goods. But customer support and customer success is often not considered as part of COGS. They're more considered and classified as operational expenses, OpEx. It's a cost of doing business overall. So in this situation, when we're thinking of minimizing support costs, it's not going to impact COGS, and therefore it's not going to impact gross margin, and therefore it's not going to impact CLV. But minimizing support costs, that's still good for the business, right? So this to me is why I think CLV is a great guiding metric, but we need to be careful about, what are the outcomes we're seeking relative to the intention of selecting a CLV metric, of using CLV overall. And I think it again falls into that trap of we shouldn't be measuring for the sake of measuring. We need to be very careful in selecting what metrics we use and how we use them.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, here's another question. How would you measure retention cost? Are they promotions, admin costs, amortized across all accounts, etc.?
I can take this one as well. So how would I measure retention costs? So I think it's similar to how I just answered cost of goods sold. It really depends on the business, the industry, things like that, right? So if we're thinking about retention overall, what does it really, what really attributes and rolls up to retention overall? So if we're thinking of promotion, admin costs, advertised across all accounts, we could look at it that way, but is that useful? And I think it comes back to what is the intention of diving into retention costs and what attributes to retention. Is it something that we can actually make an impact on? Is it something that we can actually segment out and calculate? Right. So I think it's more about understanding what the spirit is before we consider, what's included. Even think of my first example of CLV right at the beginning of the webinar when we were talking about, how do we define what a customer tenure is? It might be useful to look at only 5 years if there's been significant changes in the company operations. It might be better to look at a customer in terms of 20 years. It kind of depends on what we're trying to achieve and what's going to make sense for looking at a particular metric. And more importantly, thinking about closing the loop, Amy, what can we do when we find trends and how do we actually use that information? So that's a long-winded way of saying it depends. And it really gets into thinking and being mindful about why are we using CLV? Why are we using retention? And how is it going to benefit us from benchmarking it?
And I think just to sort of tie into that, Kevin, I think it's one of those really interesting things because either my best or my worst answer when I'm talking to clients every day, trying to put together a solution is it depends and maybe. I feel like the context of every company, the way that they're set up, if you look at, a Fortune 500 company compared to somebody that's even in like the bottom Fortune 1000, the way that the infrastructure, the hierarchies, the processes, the data management, all of these elements kind of go into what data you have access to, where you can actually get information from, and then what the intention of either the respective business unit, the executive leadership team. There's so many moving parts, even just at a high level of where all of these bits and pieces live and how they're categorized. So when we talk about CLV within like a specific UX team, for example, there's absolutely a calculation that can be done for that, but whether or not that aligns to sort of that executive CLV, those are two totally sort of different metrics, use cases, examples, and sets of data that go into them.
Great. Thank you both. I know sometimes I really hate answering the question with that depends and then following with more questions, but that's the reality we have today. All right, we have another great question from the audience. How do you apply CLV in a non-tangible service like insurance, higher ed, finance, where acquisition latency is elongated and the consumption or initial use is lengthy?
I'll take this a little bit before I pass it back over to Kevin here, because I think the really key thing that he just said, it pertains to tenure. So not every box is created equal. Not every calculation has to be set up the same way. So something like for insurance, for mortgages, FinServ, we see this a lot in as well. When you're trying to calculate 25 and 30 years, every 5 years renewals come up. You're looking at churn rates, stickiness in those smaller segments of what is a larger segment, essentially. But being able to break those down with a modifier of things like tenure, of consistent, maintenance and acquisition, those are all factors that do inevitably go into calculating that formula. Kevin, was that accurate? I guess is probably the better question.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I would answer that question. It's CLV is fantastic. Let's get a little bit deeper. What makes up CLV and what are some of the things that we can attribute to CLV? And that includes segmenting the business, segmenting the customers in ways that you can compare and contrast CLV. Because at the end of the day, what businesses are trying to do is increase CLV, right? We want to increase customer lifetime value. And how do we do that? It's going to be different for different demographics, for different cohorts, for different, even different divisions in the business. And I'm sure between insurance, higher education, and finance, there are going to be different ways of segmenting the customer base and different things we want to do with that either. So what is interesting is that latency bit though, right? Because when we're thinking about renewing insurance, that could be once every 5 years, 10 years, things like that. And it's pretty difficult to really capture and understand, like what are, I think that's where we want to look at the data points in between, right? Are there life changes or life events in between point A and point B, and maybe there's a 10-year span in between that? Where can we look at other customers and demographics to kind of mimic and try to determine what a cohort A and cohort B, are they similar? Do they look alike? Can we say that cohort A turns into cohort B at a certain time? Things like that would be very interesting, and that really has to do with applying other data, other telemetry towards these customer groups in conjunction with things that attribute up to CLV. So absolutely, Paul, agreed 100%.
And I'll give I just thought of a great sort of real life example of what you just said, Kevin. So I have this real estate agent, comes by my house once a year. He's been doing it for 9 or 10 years. I know he does this to a bunch of my neighbors. He stops by once a year, sends a Christmas card. That's just what he does, because he knows inevitably that maybe 10% of us, 20% of us will sell a house at some point. And that sort of ties into something called top of mind marketing, TOMA. So car companies, they just want you to sit at, when you're buying a car, top 3 brands. That's all that you want. So he is sort of reaching out. He is engaging with us at these very specific touch points to assume that 10 or 20% of us are going to sell our house at some point, and he's going to be one of the first 3 people we call. That's it. And he has been doing that now, I think, for over 10 years. And he's delightful. And it is absolutely very specific. It is a personalized way to market his services in an incredibly crowded market. But the lifetime value of all of the marketing efforts that he's doing pays off massive dividends one of those days.
That's great. I love it, Paul. All right. We'll do a couple more questions. So we have one here. Have the increases in technology innovation over the last decade changed how we capture CLV, or how deeply we can go to capture it now?
I'll take that one as somebody that is in tech stacks every day, all day. I think that it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think on one side, having visibility, having those sort of listing posts, having those digital touch points, all of those things are fantastic. They give us more insight. They allow us to segment and understand our customers arguably better than we ever have before. But with all of this information and data that comes out of it, it's really easy to sort of get in the weeds or use metrics the wrong way, or use things that I tend to call vanity metrics, things that do exist that are important data points, but don't actually impact CLV or what the goal of you utilizing data is for. So I think that, yes, fantastic, wonderful to have as much insight and intelligence as we do right now. But I think that you sort of have to take it with a bit of a magnifying glass. You have to be very specific. You have to be very intentional with which data you use and how you calculate these things, because otherwise, let's go back to my shoe example. How many laces I buy, super important if we also sell laces, but not the way that we're trying to calculate something on the front end. The same way that when you do region-specific marketing, that has a very drastic impact on CLV as well. So it really kind of depends on, I'll say it again. It depends on the context. Maybe I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's also simpler, just to give you a non-convoluted answer.
Thank you, Paul. All right, let's do another one. So does prioritizing CLV have an impact on new customer acquisition or just existing customers?
I can grab this one. So I think prioritizing CLV, it's definitely going to have an impact on both new customer acquisition as well as existing customers, right? By just thinking about CLV, it's customer revenue, it's customer retention, and it's the cost of acquiring them. Doesn't matter if they're a new customer or an existing customer, those things are going to always be in play. So the short answer is both. But now where it gets kind of interesting is if we segment that CLV for those two different groups or cohorts of customers and bring in those other variables and the demographic data and start correlating that with each group CLV. So now we're going to be able to see, how do different customer groups behave, whether they're defined as new customers or existing customers, whether that is older customers like, the baby boomers versus millennials. That might be a different way to, and an interesting way to segment as well. And I'm even thinking thinking to telcos, telecommunications, internet services, cellular services. We often see, especially as Black Friday comes around, we often see really, really good offers to bring in those new customers at extremely low rates, and they're heavily incentivized and they're trying to grab market share from each other. It would be really interesting to see how telcos think about CLV and what strategies they would employ to raise CLV in these new customers that they bring in at those very low rates. It's definitely going to be a different CLV strategy than the existing customers that, they may not be happy with their service across 10 years, but they are not unhappy enough to make a change. So those strategies are going to be very different in how they approach them.
Great. All right. Thank you for that, Kevin, and thank you, Paul. All right, before we actually end this webinar, we wanted to remind you that one lucky winner will actually be chosen at the end of December to win a free customer journey mapping offer from Alida. Again, it's free. As I explained before, customer journey mapping will help you identify customer pain points, help you better understand how customers prefer to interact with your brand, and highlight opportunities to increase value along their journey with you. The offer will include one-on-one stakeholder interviews, synthesis of data collected into a map in PDF format, and a custom set of CX program recommendations. For more information, please get in touch with your Alida team. And on a final note, Kevin, Paul, and I wanted to thank you, the audience, for your engagement and excellent questions. We also deeply appreciate the Alida marketing team for giving us the opportunity to talk to you all today. So thank you.